Hello everyone, my name is Pixlriffs and welcome back to the Minecraft Survival Guide. I hope you're all having a good day. In today's episode, we're going to start a project, but really, we're going to do the episode 0 on this project, I guess you could say, because we're probably not going to do any actual building in this episode, at least not any building here in the Survival Guide world. Instead, I'm going to take you through a really important stage of the process of building something in survival, which is the preparation phase, the research, and where inspiration for builds comes from in the first place. I've already done several builds here which I wouldn't say were necessarily inspired by anything. They are just products of my own imagination, my own experience with Minecraft, and a bit of necessity because we needed a starter house, but at this stage I've built enough starter houses in a sort of rustic style that I know more or less how they're supposed to turn out. So that's really a product of just the amount that I've played Minecraft and a few ideas for building that are always percolating in my head. But today I'm going to tell you a bit more about how those ideas are formed and how you end up gaining the experience that you need to just pull designs like this out of the air. And in the process, I want to try and dispel a couple of myths about building in Minecraft, because there are some very opinionated people out there who will tell you that if you're building something in survival Minecraft, it is quote-unquote more legit if you're building it just in survival without drafting anything in creative first, if you're just building it off the top of your head. And people will also argue that it takes more imagination to come up with something completely original without using any kind of reference material. And I would argue the opposite. I would argue that it's actually going to improve your building skills if you start to take a more planned approach to something and use reference material, which is honestly something that real artists, illustrators, visual artists and stuff will do all the time. Professional artists who work on animated feature films are going to look up reference for character poses and face shapes and stuff like that. And obviously, with enough experience, they'll be able to draw all of that stuff from memory. But Minecraft is not always going to be a task of how well can you memorize the skills that you need to do everything in survival. Some people are going to want to do the stuff that way, and that's totally fine. But in my case, I prefer to look up a few things as inspiration for builds before I undertake them. Even this factory here, which has a very original feeling color palette and something that's sort of a mishmash of all sorts of different materials, I looked up shapes, I looked up existing brick factories in the UK, and I figured out what would make them fit with a Minecraft world, allowing for a gradient of building material instead of just making the entire thing out of brick. Projects like my storage building were not based on any pre-existing designs. I copied a couple of design elements from houses I had already built, but I definitely did a bunch of planning in a creative mode test world to figure out what exactly this style of building was going to look like on this scale, because this is a larger storage room than anything I've really built before. And that also explains why I haven't done much on the interior, because in my experience, it is much easier to design exteriors than interiors. Anyway, what all this is building up to is a project that I want to start somewhere over here in my world, a little bit further away from the central settlement, but still as part of the central set of builds for this world. And it all centers around a piece of art that I stumbled upon almost by accident. You see, over the holidays, I was spending some time browsing Instagram, and I followed a couple of artist accounts, but one of the Instagram suggested posts was for an artist called Gregory Fromenteau. Now, Greg Fromenteau has been on the art team for several video game companies in the past. He lives in Montreal, so I presume he's worked at Ubisoft Montreal, so you might be familiar with some of his work already. But in this case, his personal illustration portfolio, as you see it on Instagram, and it's elsewhere on ArtStation. He even has a print store that I'll probably be buying stuff from. But he works on a variety of different designs, does some character portraits, but also does these really interesting studies in landscapes and cityscapes and blending the two of them, and introduces some interesting organic elements like houses on the backs of fish, or giant turtles, or, whales flying around in the sky above a town. And I love a lot of this illustration style, but the piece that was shown to me by my Instagram feed was this one. Now, according to his print store, this piece is called Pirate Rock Sailing, and what I love about this is the fact that it blends something like a floating island with a more structural element that you don't see as often in Minecraft. There are dedicated ship builders who often build large, watercraft and stuff like that, but you don't always see people attempting stuff like this in Minecraft because they are fairly large and detailed builds, and it's easy to get them wrong. But as soon as I saw this, I thought, wow, that'd make a really cool Minecraft build. It fits with a lot of stuff Minecraft already has. Sometimes floating islands generate as part of the terrain. There are shipwrecks in the game already, so wouldn't it be cool if we could turn this into a Minecraft build? And in terms of inspiration, this is one of the places inspiration comes from. For me, it's just seeing cool images by artists online and thinking, how would I interpret that in Minecraft blocks? And so that's why over here on the other side of the mountain, beyond which we have built our storage room and starter houses and everything else, in this valley where we started that big stone mine with our first beacon, I'm going to build the floating island from Greg Fromenteau's Pirate Rock sailing piece in the curve of this valley. That's the plan, at least. And plans might change as we go along. I might decide I want to build it over here or somewhere else where there's a bit more of a dip in the valley and we can see it from a different angle. But I figure if I'm going to be standing on top of this mountain at some stage looking down over this valley, it would be really cool to see the silhouette of that island, and as we get closer, we'd be able to see the ship resting on top of it. But the lesson I want you folks to take away from this is that if you want to get inspiration, it comes from basically everywhere. Naturally, there's a ton of original art online that you could interpret as a piece to build in Minecraft, but even if you want to go out and study real-life buildings, if you want to build some stuff from your neighborhood or the nearest city or anything like that, you can build civic buildings, you can build local houses, you can do a ton of different stuff. And after you've been playing this game for a while, you've probably got the itch to build some of that stuff that you've been seeing. So obviously, getting a decent amount of reference photos is a good way to do that. If you're taking pictures of stuff in an urban environment, then you're going to be able to get a couple of different reference pictures to understand the scale of the building and figure out what you need to push and pull in order to make it work in-game. Obviously, with a piece like Pirate Rock Sailing, we are going to have to do a bit of a creative interpretation of this, because while it is a floating island and you see a bit of perspective in the picture, there's a bit of landmass leading up to where the ship is beached. The problem with this is we can't see the back or sides of the piece. It's only a two-dimensional image, so we're going to have to do a bit of creative interpretation. But obviously inspiration comes at you from a bunch of different angles, and it may be that you have an idea for something specific you want to build in your world, but you haven't seen any pictures of it or reference, and you don't have something in the outside world that you want to bring into Minecraft. You have an idea that you want to bring into Minecraft and you're not sure how to visualize it. Well, naturally, that's where a good old Google image search will come in handy, but it's a good habit to get into when you save these images. Record the artist's name or perhaps where you found it as well. That way you've got a library of stuff that you can refer to later. You can remember who an artist was if you want to go back and see more of their stuff, and you can direct other observers to that person's art if you want them to get the credit for the original idea. One good place a Google image search might lead you is an artist's portfolio somewhere like ArtStation. ArtStation is a website where artists will host a bunch of images that they have created themselves, and is also a place where you can filter out anything that was generated using AI. Obviously, in the art world, AI is this kind of hot button issue right now, and I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of that necessarily, but I will say, if you are generating something using AI as inspiration in Minecraft, it's always worth bearing in mind that traditional artists and actual trained artists will probably have a better eye for composition than tools like AI do right now. With that said, if you're just looking for ideas to kind of kickstart your brain and get a vibe for something that you want to build in Minecraft, I don't think there's too much issue with using AI art. However, I think a lot of the time you can find similar stuff from existing artists out there, and that will give you everything you need with a little bit more of a foundation in reality. Let's say if you want some art inspiration for a medieval house build or a medieval town, then you'll be able to find tons of stuff on ArtStation created by real artists that might look a little bit more well put together than something that's going to be generated by ChatGPT. So in my case, I found something I want to build in Minecraft based on a piece of original artwork, and I found the place more or less where I want to build it in the survival guide world. What is the next step? Well, for me, the next step is probably to log out of my survival guide world and open up my creative test world. And a creative flat world like this is often where I end up testing ideas, whether it's for builds, redstone contraptions, images for thumbnails, the categories for my storage system in the survival guide world, even little YouTube shorts like the one where I explained that smokers and blast furnaces give the same amount of XP as regular furnaces. But it is here that we're going to do some palette tests, which will be the first step in trying to design Pirate Rock Sailing in our survival guide world. Now, right away, it's pretty obvious that we want to do something with stone and I think probably tuff as well for the base of this island. In fact, there are even places where cobblestone and deep slate might be useful for the palette as well, because cobblestone has a lot of highlights and also has a lot of darker areas. That could be a really good block for blending with the tuff. And then deep slate provides a darker element that we can still use as a stone type, and that can add a few shadows in places where the game doesn't naturally create shadows if we want to give it some of the effect that Greg's floating island does. Now, Greg's floating island actually has a lot of blue in the rock underneath that grassy plain, so it might be worth looking into blocks like, let's say, prismarine, and we just scrolled past the warped wood as well, but there's a potential to include blocks like this if we want to go the bluer route, and those certainly, if you would say to color pick this using Photoshop, it would bring up colors similar to what we get from prismarine and warped wood. The problem with prismarine, of course, being that it changes color over time and can look a little bit green at certain times, so it doesn't always go with warped wood as well as you would hope. And frankly, I think warped wood we can leave out of it. I think the way Greg has shaded this piece and added color to it is really cool for the composition in a 2D piece like this. But in Minecraft, I think we're going to rely a lot more on shape than we are texture, and I think adding in those blue highlights might look a little bit too complex and a bit too busy. That's maybe something we can try out once we have a bit more of the actual shape of the floating island realized in-game. But I think for the moment, these 4 blocks and potentially slabs and stairs of both stone and cobblestone are going to be a great palette to begin with when building something shaped like a floating island. I'm going to try out a couple of things here on a much smaller scale than we would be building it in survival, but we can just build up a couple of floating sections of stone here to get an idea for the shape and where we want to use these materials. Here we go. I built up a little irregular, inverted cone shape that works pretty well as the base of a floating island, and obviously with a floating island on this scale, any kind of detail block is really going to stand out, so a couple of pieces of cobblestone here and there is really all we would need. It's also worth noting that we're planning on looking at this from a distance, so if you fly away and take a look at something from a distance, you'll still see the texture of something like cobblestone, whereas something like andesite is really going to blend in. We might also want to consider using a darker material to really emphasize the shadows in some of these sections, but then blend it back out into a lighter material like the cobblestone or natural stone further out. So if we step back from this and take a look from further away, the blocks of tuff in there really give a shadowy impression, and the deep slate will go even further to making that look like shading. And if we're using blocks like this for shading, that gives us the advantage that we don't have to dig out a bunch of really recessed alcoves in the rock in order for this to work. To show you what I mean, I'm going to fill a section over here with stone, and we're going to use this as a kind of sculpting exercise. If you want an archway of stone like this and you want to make it look shadowy, you really have to dig quite far back for the game's lighting to kick in and for it to give us that shadowy kind of shading. In fact, right here, the lighting feels fairly even, and I'm just using the default lighting in the game with the brightness set to full bright. That's really for YouTube visibility. If I switch the brightness down to moody, you will see that this section here gets a lot more shadowy, but that is still 4 blocks back from the entrance here. If we set the brightness back to bright, you'll see that that section there doesn't really look all that deep, even though it is cut back 4 meters from the entrance. Whereas if we start to work in a few of these more shaded blocks, like let's say we build a little bit of tuff and deep slate around here, from further away, using darker material like this can make the interior of that look a little bit more shadowy looking without you having to worry about adjusting the lighting in game. That's a technique I've used a bunch of times before, and it's definitely going to help us when we're carving out this floating island, which is going to be a lot larger than what you see right here, because once again, we need to fit an entire ship on top of it. Looking ahead to what else is on top of this though, obviously the scale we're going to be working at is quite large, because the original piece has people walking around on it and different pieces of equipment being loaded onto this ship, various people working the sails and the rigging. So we want to operate on quite a large scale if we want that to be to player scale. If one of those little people is going to be the size of a Minecraft player, then this whole thing is going to be pretty big. It's also got enough room for some natural features like grass and trees to be present on this island. It isn't just a hunk of rock with a ship on it, it's actually got a natural landscaped feel. So of course in our palette we're going to be including a little bit of grass, and maybe the grass will hang down over the sides of the island here and there, but obviously on a larger scale that's going to look a little better than it does here with this small scale, almost 5x5 surface we have up here on the top of this floating island test. The grassland in Greg's piece is a lot more yellow, so we could consider using something like path blocks in order to get that overall impression. This would also benefit us in one sense because path blocks are not spawnable blocks, and so we wouldn't have to do as much lighting of this area so that it would not spawn mobs at night if we converted the entire thing into path blocks. So that's something I might consider doing, because the only other alternative to get that kind of grass color would be to build this in a savanna biome, which is not my current plan. However, I feel like we can do a decent amount with grass blocks, and we are changing the palette of the piece a little bit, but remember, we've already done that with the stone section below that. It will also give us the opportunity to use moss blocks around the edge of the island here, which can hide the dirt sides of the grass blocks if you don't want those to show up. We can blend it into the grass texture on top of the island here, where it definitely won't blend in with the path blocks. We're also going to add a couple of custom trees to this island, and naturally, if you're using oak leaves or one of those leaves that changes color with the biome, that's not going to match the grass color if we use grass path. So once again, we can take a bit of our own interpretation into this build and adjust bits and pieces depending on what we think will look better in Minecraft versus what looked better to Greg when he was drawing this illustration. But I think we can pretty safely add some grass, some moss, a couple of logs for the custom trees, and of course some leaves to our block palette here. Of course, beyond that, the challenge becomes how we construct the ship itself, because there are obviously going to be several elements of this ship that I'm not as familiar with as somebody who doesn't know a great deal about the anatomy of ships. So that is possibly a second path of research that I could go down to make sure that I'm building the ship somewhat accurately. But at this point, I'm fairly certain that the body of the ship is going to be made out of something like spruce wood. We might end up using stripped spruce or spruce planks at some stage in there, or maybe we'll end up using oak wood if it feels a little bit closer to the lighter color of the ship that we want. But I think spruce wood is going to be a good baseline, and I already have a great deal of it stored up in the survival guide world ready to use. We'll also probably be using white wool for the sails of the ship, considering that there are white sails on the ship in question. Some of them are free flowing and some of them are furled, so we'll need to do a little bit of work on that just to make sure that we get the shapes of those right once we start building this. There's a flag flying from the main mast, which might use a little bit of red wool, but we can go into that as its own individual thing later. The main problem we're going to face when dealing with this is that there are a lot of ropes and rigging involved in this ship, and it's going to be difficult to simulate those using Minecraft blocks because they so often occur at angles which are difficult to reproduce in Minecraft. I think one way we're going to have to represent them is going to be with fences, because fences from a distance are going to look like ropes. The only other way we can really simulate ropes is by using leads, and those are going to look a lot more natural but will be harder to set up because you can't simply attach a lead to two blocks. It has to be attached to something compatible like a fence post, and first of all it needs to be attached to a mob. But the thing about leads is that they are really too thin to be seen from a distance. If I fly away a little bit, the knot around that fence is also going to disappear and you can barely see where the lead is at all. At the scale that we're building, it's just going to disappear, and that's why even though they are a lot more angular, it's going to make a lot more sense for the fences to be used as rigging. It's also going to mean that the ship isn't exclusively populated by chickens, so I think we'll throw out that idea. So at this point, I'd say we have a fairly simple starter palette for our floating island. We've got the island stuff and the terrain features all arranged in this palette, which is only 8 blocks. And over here, we have a couple of blocks which are going to be used to build the ship. Now, as we go, we are going to find opportunities to texture a lot of this and bring it to life in new and interesting ways. Like in Greg's Pirate Rock sailing piece, the hull of the ship actually blends with the land beneath it. It becomes more of like a house structure than it does the curved underside of a ship. And it blends with the landscape in more organic ways. It kind of folds into the bushes and terrain around it. So we might want to add in stuff like glow lichen a little bit later to help ease that transition. But I think those details will come out as we try and build this thing. I think the most important thing now is to take the extra step of trying to build some elements of this and see how they work together. And I'm actually going to start with the ship. And I'm going to start from a block fairly high up in the sky here, and we're going to build the ship from this point upwards so that we have room to add in some of the elements of the floating island below this afterwards if I like the way the ship turned out. So I don't have to spend a bunch of time cloning this ship build and moving it around. If I'm happy with the way it looks, we can just build the rest of the stuff underneath it. And I'm starting with the ship because I think that's the element that's going to dictate the size of the island we need to build. We can build a fairly convincing floating island at basically any scale, but if we need to get the scale of the ship right so that the rigging looks good and so that, you know, all of the fences and stuff don't look too angular, it actually all feels part of a coherent piece, then that's the point at which we can decide how big the floating island needs to be in order to support that piece. So if anything, I'm starting with the most detailed thing, figuring out the scale that it works at in Minecraft, and then building everything else out around it. I think the way we're going to start this is by building out the structure supporting the ship, so we need to have a pretty decent section of panels underneath there. Above that, the body of the ship overhangs it, so we can bring out a few more wood logs, and maybe underneath we can turn some of these logs into spruce wood. That will also give the impression that it's casting a curved shadow, which could be a really interesting element of this piece to help it feel a bit more curved, even though the body of the ship is going to be fairly boxy. And just based on feel, I think it maybe needs to be another 3-block section longer on both ends, but that will be a good point to start building out the ship. I'm really just feeling out the scale of the piece right now, but I think that's going to be a good place to begin. All I know for certain at this point is that we're probably going to have to build a massive floating island to support this, but I'm up for the challenge. After a little bit more work, I've sketched out the side of this. It's certainly looking a little bit nautical. I gotta say, I think it's coming together okay. I've started to fudge a couple of elements here where it's less clear from Greg's illustration how the ship is composed. That is naturally going to be the case with some illustrations like this. There's not going to be enough detail for you to really interpret everything correctly, so you've got to guess a little bit about how some elements go together. But I think this is a decent start. I think we might need to broaden the section over here a little bit more, and probably this section at the front here. The other thing is that Greg's ship, as far as I can tell, and it may just be that the scaffolding elements around this are supposed to conceal it, but it doesn't really have a pointed prow in the same way that boats typically do to cut the waves, and that makes sense for this ship because it doesn't really have any waves to cut. It should be more aerodynamic than hydrodynamic, but I don't know if that's really going to fly in the build when we put it into Minecraft, because it's just going to look like a very boxy ship, and I think to really sell this in-game, it's going to have to look a lot more like a real boat. So I think at the front of the ship here, we're actually going to start curving this to a point. We're going to try and bring this in a little bit. That will also give us the idea of whereabouts the midpoint of the ship is going to be, and then we can design some other elements around that. To emphasize the curve, I'm actually going to shorten some of these sections so there's not 3 blocks between all of them. There's actually going to be 2 blocks here, probably another 2-block gap here, and then a 1-block gap there, and I think we'll come over 1 more block in this direction, but then I think this is going to be the midpoint of the ship. So again, it's going to be quite wide, but flying back a little bit, I think that works for the proportions of this vessel. We can maybe move this section up 1 more block if we wanted to, but I think that works out. And of course, there'll be some spars that jut forward from the front of the ship, and this gives them more structure from which to do that. So yeah, I think that's going to work out fine. The back of the ship needs building up a little bit more, but I think the shape of things is starting to come together now. Okay, so now we've got that filled in. This is feeling a lot more real to me. I want to draw a big line down the center here using these oak logs, and I've really gone for oak over spruce for the majority of this, but I think the oak log texture and the spruce plank texture work really well together in this case. There's enough contrast that it really sells the shape of things. So I'm going to draw a line all the way across here from the front to the back, and the back is going to slope upwards where there's going to be a cabin that juts out over the water at the back of the ship, or it would be if it was on water. That's also where the rudder would be if there was a rudder. I don't think we need one of those, but I do think we want to have a cabin overhanging the water at the back. It's going to feel like the captain's cabin, you know, and I think that sort of makes a great deal of sense for the structure of the ship. Once again, trying to include elements that aren't necessarily in the illustration, but are something which in-game will turn this into a 3D object, something that we can explore, and something that will look good from all angles. But by my understanding, the way the back of a ship works is that it's actually fairly flat at the back and just kind of curves outwards. I'm going to build this all out of spruce planks to begin with, and then we can adjust the shape as we go. So I've got the back part of the ship built here. I think it needs to be taller, and I think I also need to do a little bit more research into how these things are shaped, because while it's going to have an overhanging section here which will curve it outwards slightly, I'm not quite happy with the proportions of this yet. So a bit of secondary research is going to be necessary for that, but around this side I can just mirror what we have on the opposite side, and I think that should come together pretty well. But this thing is now over 50 blocks long. It's a pretty large ship, and that was really the intention. It's obviously going to be a little bit larger once we get the spars and the, I think it's called the bowsprit. It's like pointed in that direction, and then we have a few things dangling over the back as well. We'll have the masts in the center. It's going to look pretty imposing and large, but it's also going to have a pretty large floating island supporting it. At least now we have a sense of the scale that we're working on. So for now, I'm going to continue filling in this section, and I'll see you folks on the other side. Hey folks, welcome back. So I've now mirrored everything on the opposing side. I had to do a bit of adjustment because I realized I was building this side of the hull in the wrong place. I was one block further in and this didn't quite measure out correctly, but now we've got everything figured out and I'm fairly certain I've managed to mirror the front of the ship, the fore of the ship, pretty much identically to the one on the other side. Give or take, there's like a little bit sticking out right here, which I think I need to either remove or perhaps mirror on the other side so that that can look identical. Alright, that's perfect. And I was able to figure out the back of the ship here after a little bit of research in which I discovered that I was more or less on the money with the shape of this. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach the shape of the back of a ship like this, and there are definitely some very ornate examples of galleons with a very kind of ornate rear face to them. And that's the kind of thing that I decided to step away from simply because you could go down a lot of different routes with it, and I wanted the ship to remain relatively simple looking, since that's kind of the spirit of the original illustration. One thing that research did highlight for me, though, is the fact that I started off with this section here feeling like the center of the ship, and I imagined that this rigging here with the oak fences would be attached to the main mast, which would be the central of the three masts we're going to build. But of course, now we have built this out and I've added a little bit more to the back and rounded off the front, it looks like that isn't in the center of the ship anymore. In fact, the center is probably more like here. So we're going to balance out the rigging slightly. We will have one set of rigging that starts here, and that's going to support the foremast, and we'll have that come down to the side of the ship here, where we're probably going to put in something like trapdoors. We'll do oak trapdoors for now, but maybe we'll consider doing something else, and that's going to at least give the impression that the rigging is tied off to this. We can't really do a whole lot about underneath that, but if this is the rigging that's attached to the foremast, we actually want the foremast to line up here so that the rigging attaches to the back of it. That way it doesn't interfere with the sail. And this is one of the things that I've learned through a little bit of research, is that the rigging kind of rigs behind the mast at all times. That way it's easy to ascend it without getting in the way of the sail. And I think the masts we are going to make out of a different type of wood, and I'm tempted to use spruce wood for this simply because we've used it elsewhere, but some of the wood types are going to have a slightly rounder wood grain to them, which makes jungle or perhaps mangrove kind of ideal for this. And I think despite how red the end texture is, we're not going to be seeing the end texture as much, so I think mangrove is sort of the ideal wood type for this. Now, of course, in terms of scale, a single log of mangrove here is going to feel like too little for the scale of this ship that we're working with. On the other hand, it feels like a 3x3 might actually be too much. Yeah, that definitely feels far too large for this ship, far too solid. And so what I think we're going to have to do, since we can't do a 2x2 because this is an odd-numbered build, it has a single central line instead of a two-wide line, what we're going to do is knock this down so it's more like a plus shape. And while that might still seem kind of bulky, it's nowhere near as bulky as it would have been as a 3x3. So I think we can probably stick with that. But then from there to the top gallants, we only need to have a single log going up through the center, and I think that should work out okay. We're going to do the same thing with the main mast. We're going to start it one block over from the center here, and that's going to be a big plus shape as well. This is going to be taller than the foremast, but only slightly. You might be tempted to make this the biggest mast out of all of them, but realistically, it's not going to be that much larger. And then we're going to need some rigging for the mizzen mast here as well, but that's going to be attached to the deck instead of attached to the exterior of the ship's hull, so we don't need to worry too much about where that's going to go right now. At this point, pretty much all of the terminology I'm using for the anatomy of this ship is taken from a diagram I found explaining the different parts of a Sea of Thieves galleon, so if any of this language seems familiar from that, that's probably why. So those are the positions of our three masts, and looking at it right here, I might move the foremast forward by one block, and maybe we can make adjustments to the rigging, or maybe we can just have it kind of move at a diagonal, just kind of move one block over like this and continue the same pattern so it matches up with where the mast is going to go, but it just seems like it needs a little bit more room this way. And the rigging is going to attach to the mast directly underneath one of the spars that holds the sails. So let's say if this one's going to be about here, that's like 5 or 6 blocks away from the top of the mast, the rigging is going to attach directly underneath this, and so that's where we want to make sure our fences are going to connect. That can help us establish the angle at which these fences are going to rise, and we'll just mirror the same thing on the opposite side when we're ready to do that. Each of these is going to be a block or two longer the further down the mast we go, and we want to attach 3 to each of these masts. And as always, the great thing about working in creative before you try and build stuff like this in survival is that you eliminate all of the time that goes into the trial and error process, because you can simply fly up and adjust things instead of having to either climb up there in survival or fly up using elytra and adjust things on the fly. It's a lot easier to take a step back and take a look at your work and decide what needs to change. So I think proportions-wise, that's looking about right. We still need to add a couple more details into the mast here. There's going to be a couple of platforms for sailors to stand on and a lookout from, like a crow's nest kind of thing. Doesn't matter hugely to me whether or not these are accessible to the player from the deck. Of course, you could put a ladder up the main mast if you wanted to and just cut out one of these slabs so you could hop into this spot here. And of course, we can add walls to the top of each of these masts. Mud brick is the only brown wall that we can really work with, but we can add something like this and fly a flag from the main mast to let people know we're coming. I think for the long spars that come out from the bow, I'm going to be using the same type of wood as I'm using for the masts, just to kind of give that overall impression that this is made of the same type of wood. Of course, if you don't want the end texture to show, we could always use the 6-sided bark blocks like that. And in Greg's illustration, there's another one that comes out from here at a much steeper angle. So I think I'm going to attempt that, maybe just going up by a block and along by 2 blocks each time, although maybe it needs to be steeper than this. In this case, a pattern of 2 blocks, 1 block, 2 blocks, or 1 block at a diagonal like this seems to work best for the angle. And obviously that looks a little bit strange considering none of it is connected in this way. But we're also going to add a spruce wood platform just over halfway up. There are a few fixtures and braces here and there that we can probably mock up with stairs if we want to. And there are going to be ropes hanging from here and there as well. I think we'll put a lantern at the end of that one. That seems like a sensible thing to do, kind of like an anglerfish. Yeah, not too bad overall. I think we're getting there. We've got to add a couple of sails in here, of course. That's what we want the white wool for, and I need to finish the rigging and decide where some of the other ropes are going to go. We're not going to add as many ropes as Greg has in the illustration, because a lot of those are fairly simple, straightforward lines for Greg to draw, whereas for us, they have to be zigzags of fences, and so we don't want this whole thing to look too cluttered if we can help it. But maybe we can get away with doing some stuff like this, where we've got the oak fences in the foreground and the spruce fences in the background, to once again imply that shading feel, to give the impression that those are in the background by making them a little darker. We've now got the flag on top here to indicate that the wind is blowing southerly, so it's blowing from the south and it's blowing towards the north, meaning that we can make any of the sails that we have unfurled kind of blow in that direction as well, but the majority of them I think are going to be rolled up, just to make it slightly easier for us to build, for one thing. I'm experimenting with a few details here as well, like using trapdoors as though they are coils of rope wrapped around some of these spars, and I think that works quite well. And really what's left to do now is expand these ideas to the rest of the vessel here, but this is going to be quite complex to reproduce in survival if we do all of the rope work here and try to reproduce it block for block. So I'm just going to do a little bit more here to make sure that I like the ideas, and then we'll try to reproduce them in survival with a little bit more of the decision making happening on the fly. Okay, a little bit of sail work is in, a little bit of rope work is in, and I've made 2 very important discoveries. Number 1, grindstones as pulleys make perfect sense in all of these rope work formations, because they can be used to combine 2 separate sections of rope that are moored in different places attached to these pins around the outside here on the rail, and I think that's going to make a lot of sense both as a way to combine different types of rope, so, you know, the people on deck are just hauling on one section of rope, but it's moving multiple parts of the sail. Makes perfect sense if you just got a limited amount of crew and you need to furl sail quickly. The other thing is they break up these lines of rope so that they feel a little bit more dynamic, and so you're not just left with big sections of the same material. It works really well for the rigging, and I think the rigging looks pretty decent as it is. It's going to be a bit messy anyway, so that's not too much of a problem, but to differentiate the ropes that are used to set up the sails and to, you know, furl and unfurl the sails, it makes perfect sense to have pulleys in here as a little bit of decoration as well as some kind of practical touch, and grindstones are perfect for that. The second thing I've discovered is that down here, a combination of tough, mossy cobblestone moss and a few occasional leaves looks really good against all of the spruce wood that we've been using for the hull of the ship, and that's going to help blend it into the terrain of the island in a way that I think will work really, really well in practice. So that was one of the things that I was worried about as a hurdle for this build that we have now cleared, and I'm ready to work on a little bit more of the shape of this before we wrap up this episode. But you know what? I think we've made really solid progress towards a build that we can actually execute in survival, and this would have taken me 4 or 5 times as long had we tried it in a survival context first. So once again, the research stage, the planning stage has all led to this kind of test stage in creative, and I think the project has been so much better because of that step. There are some very talented builders out there who will be able to reproduce something like this in survival, but I don't quite work that way, and it's the same way as how people learn differently. If you're a visual learner, or if you prefer to just read information from the page and can grasp it that way, people operate in lots of different ways. So don't let anybody shame you into thinking that doing stuff in creative before you build it in survival is any less legit. I personally think this project is so much better simply because I tried it in creative first. So I'm going to do a little bit more work on this. I'm going to add a couple more details in, probably figure out where the decks are going to go and do a little bit more landscaping around the outside here, and then we will wrap up for this episode and we'll do a little bit more work on the actual construction of this in a future episode. Okay, we are looking good, we are getting there. I've done a tiny bit more work, not too much more, but I've at least started to map out where the deck is going to go, and I'm fairly happy with it so far. Obviously, I'm not really working from the illustration at this point. I'm starting to fill in the 3D elements that aren't really present in the 2D image, and so this deck here needs some place for the wheel to go. It's probably not going to go directly behind the mizzen mast. It's going to go in front of that so that the person at the wheel can at least see a little bit around them without a sail getting in the way too much. I think at least that's where it logically needs to go. On some sort of raised deck somewhere makes sense, and then the stairs down either side here can, of course, give a bit more room in the aft for the captain's cabin to go, where they'll have some windows to look out of the rear of the ship. We've also got an area down here where it can step down to the main deck. That's where the capstan would be, and a bunch of other bits and pieces, a lot of pins and belaying ropes and stuff like that, all of which is going to be added in the final iteration of this. But I'm really happy with how this has come together, and the other thing I wanted to test was just a little bit of blending with the landscape down here so we can merge it with that grassy area I was talking about earlier. Add some scaffolding in so that we can get to and from the deck in survival if we want to walk around on the land and then hop up to the rail of the ship. But at this point, we've at least proved that this can be done, and the rest of it is just going to be a little bit of busy work and a bunch of creative time, just putting together some of these elements and making sure they all gel together. But I'm really happy with this. We're going to leave the episode there, and I know a lot of this has been in creative versus in survival, but like I said, I want to show you folks my process, the process of taking an idea from just inspiration images and stuff like that you found online into a finished product in Minecraft. And then we're going to build it all in the survival guide world, and this will be a really awesome landmark to be hanging there in the sky above that valley near our base. So folks, that's where we're going to wrap up this episode of the Minecraft survival guide. I guess it's been a survival guide, more or less, but we'll be seeing this come together in survival before long. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this return to the series. My name has been Pixlriffs. Don't forget to leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you folks soon. Take care. Bye for now.